On the morning of April 18, 1943, 6 Japanese Zero fighters flew close escort around a pair of Mitsubishi bombers on a routine inspection flight over the jungle near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. Aboard one of those bombers sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the man who, 10 months earlier, had watched his own plan collapse in 6 catastrophic minutes at Midway. What none of the men in that formation knew was that American codebreakers had read Yamamoto's precise flight schedule days earlier, and that a squadron of long-range American fighters was, at that exact moment, racing toward them low over open water after a flight so long and so precisely timed that it remains one of the most audacious fighter missions of the entire war. The aircraft flying that mission was one most Japanese pilots had never faced in this kind of engagement before. A strange, twin-boomed American fighter Japanese aviators called Perahara, or in some accounts simply the fork-tailed devil, and one of the Zero pilots escorting Yamamoto that day would later describe, in a post-war account, watching it do something no Zero in his formation could match: turn a fight into a dive, and simply vanish. This is the story of the P-38 Lightning, the airplane built to solve a range problem that ended up deciding one of the most consequential single missions of the Pacific War. The pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron who flew that mission had been given almost no advance warning of just how significant their target was. Many were briefed only hours before takeoff, told simply that an important high-ranking officer would be traveling aboard one of 2 bombers on a specific route, without being told his name or rank in the initial mission briefing, a level of compartmentalized secrecy typical of operations built on intelligence too sensitive to risk exposing even to the men flying the mission itself. The P-38 Lightning was not originally designed with dogfighting in the Pacific in mind at all. Lockheed's design team, led by engineer Kelly Johnson, had built the aircraft in the years before the war to meet a demanding United States Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of speeds and climb rates far beyond anything else flying at the time. The result was one of the strangest-looking fighters of the war: a twin-engine, twin-boom design with the cockpit mounted in a short central nacelle between 2 long-tail booms. An arrangement that looked almost more like 2 airplanes fused together than a single fighter. The unusual layout was not accidental showmanship. It gave the P-38 something almost no single-engine fighter of the era could match: the ability to keep flying and fighting on one engine if the other was shot out, and enough raw power from 2 separate engines to achieve a combination of speed, climb, and range that outclassed nearly everything else in the sky at high altitude. That range proved to be the P-38's single most valuable quality in the vast, empty distances of the Pacific Theater, where targets were often separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean, with no place to land in between. Early Pacific warfighters like the Wildcat, and even the early Zero variants, simply did not have the fuel capacity to escort bombers or intercept targets at truly long range. The P-38, flying with external drop tanks, could cover distances that made missions previously considered impossible suddenly realistic, including, as it would turn out, a 4-engine round-trip flight of roughly 1,000 miles over open water to intercept a single enemy aircraft carrying one very specific passenger. The P-38's firepower was as distinctive as its silhouette. Unlike most fighters of the era, which mounted machine guns out in the wings, where their combined fire had to be aimed to converge at a single distance in front of the aircraft, the Lightning concentrated 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose, all firing in a straight, parallel line with no convergence point at all. For a skilled pilot, this meant devastatingly accurate fire at almost any range, a stream of bullets that hit exactly where the pilot aimed, rather than only at one calibrated distance. Pilots transitioning to the P-38 from single-engine fighters often described a real adjustment period. The aircraft was heavier and less nimble at low speed and low altitude, than a Zero or even an early Wildcat, and in the hands of an inexperienced pilot who tried to turn and dogfight the way he might in a lighter aircraft, it could be outmaneuvered exactly the way American tacticians had learned never to attempt against a Zero. But pilots who learned to fly the P-38 to its actual strengths, using altitude, speed, and diving energy rather than tight turns, found an aircraft that could dictate almost every engagement on its own terms, attack from above, dive through, and use speed to disengage before the enemy could respond. Precisely the same energy-fighting doctrine American forces were independently developing for the Hellcat around the same period, arrived at from a different airframe but the identical underlying principle. By April of 1943, 10 months after the disaster at Midway, Isoroku Yamamoto remained the single most important commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and American intelligence knew it. Station Hypo and its sister codebreaking units, the same network of cryptanalysts who had unraveled Yamamoto's plan for Midway, intercepted and decoded a detailed itinerary for an inspection tour Yamamoto planned to make of forward Japanese air bases in the Solomon Islands, a trip intended in part to boost the morale of frontline units after a string of grinding defeats. The intercepted message specified Yamamoto's exact route, his exact schedule down to the minute, and confirmed he would be traveling in a Mitsubishi bomber with a fighter escort, flying a fixed, predictable course near Bougainville. The decision to act on this intelligence went all the way up the American chain of command, reportedly requiring approval at the highest levels precisely because of how sensitive it was to reveal, even implicitly, that American codebreakers could read Japanese communications with this degree of precision. If Japan ever suspected its codes had been broken this thoroughly, it could change its entire communications system overnight and blind American intelligence for the rest of the war. The mission was approved anyway, on the calculation that killing the single most capable and respected commander in the Japanese Navy was worth the risk, and the task of carrying it out fell to the pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, based at Guadalcanal, flying the only aircraft in the American inventory with the range to make the interception possible at all, the P-38 Lightning. The mission, later codenamed Operation Vengeance, demanded a level of precision navigation that had rarely been attempted in aerial combat up to that point. Major John Mitchell, tasked with planning the flight, had to route 18 P-38s on a nearly 600-mile outbound leg, flying low over open ocean, far below Japanese radar coverage, on a dogleg course specifically designed to avoid detection from Japanese-held islands along the more direct route. There were no landmarks over open water to correct course by, no radio beacons to home in on without revealing the mission to Japanese listening posts, and no margin for error in fuel calculation given the extreme range involved. Mitchell navigated almost entirely by dead reckoning, compass heading and elapsed time, timing the flight so precisely that the American fighters were scheduled to intercept Yamamoto's aircraft at almost the exact minute it was due to arrive over Bougainville, a rendezvous calculated across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean with no way to adjust once committed. There was also a deeper strategic calculation behind the decision to act on the intercepted itinerary, one that went beyond simply removing a skilled commander. American planners understood Yamamoto's outsized symbolic importance to Japanese military morale, a reputation built carefully over 2 years of wartime propaganda that had elevated him to something close to a legendary figure in the eyes of the Japanese public, and, just as importantly, in the eyes of his own officer corps. Killing him was not only a tactical decision aimed at degrading Japanese naval leadership. It was understood, even at the time, as a psychological blow aimed at an adversary who had built much of its wartime confidence around the personal reputation of one admiral. The plan worked with an accuracy that startled even the pilots who flew it. As the P-38s climbed to intercept altitude near Bougainville, They arrived almost exactly on schedule, spotting Yamamoto's 2 bombers and their 6-strong Zero escort at nearly the precise moment and position Mitchell's navigation had predicted. Most of the P-38 formation, tasked with providing top cover against the escorting Zeros, climbed to altitude to keep the Japanese fighters occupied, while a small flight of 4 aircraft peeled off to make the actual attack run against the bombers themselves. What followed was fast, chaotic, and decided within a matter of minutes. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber led the attack on the 2 bombers, diving to engage before the Zero escort, caught off guard by fighters appearing from an unexpected direction and unexpected range, could fully react. Both bombers were shot down within moments of each other, one crashing into the jungle canopy near Bougainville, the other ditching into the water just offshore. Yamamoto's aircraft, the one that went down over land, was found the following day by a Japanese search party. Yamamoto's body was recovered still strapped into his seat, thrown clear of the wreckage, in a scene that would be described in painstaking, almost reverent detail in the official Japanese accounts written afterward. There has been decades of dispute among historians, and even between the American pilots themselves, over exactly which of them fired the shots that brought down Yamamoto's specific bomber. A controversy that outlasted both pilots' lives and was never fully resolved, even by post-war investigations of the wreckage. The attack itself lasted only a few minutes, from first contact to the destruction of both bombers, but the margin for error throughout the entire mission had been almost non-existent. 18 P-38s had flown nearly 600 miles over open ocean, at low altitude specifically to avoid radar detection, a profile that burned fuel at a much higher rate than cruising at altitude, leaving the attacking pilots with only a narrow window of fuel remaining for combat maneuvering before they needed to turn immediately for the long flight home. Rex Barber later described the entire engagement as a blur of split-second decisions, diving through anti-aircraft fire from the escorting Zeros and ground fire near the coastline, with no opportunity to circle back for a second pass if the first attack run failed. Had Mitchell's dead reckoning navigation been off by even a few minutes in either direction, the entire squadron could have missed the intercept point completely, arrived too late to catch Yamamoto's aircraft, or worse, run critically low on fuel searching for a target that was no longer there. Of the 6 Zero pilots assigned to escort Yamamoto that morning, several survived the engagement and later gave accounts of what it had been like to suddenly find themselves defending against an attack they had no warning was coming. One of the surviving escort pilots, in a post-war interview, described the disorienting speed of the encounter, American fighters diving in from an angle and altitude the Zero formation had not been positioned to cover, and the bombers going down before the escort could organize any kind of effective defense. He also described something that stuck with him specifically about the American fighter itself, an aircraft unlike anything he had faced in previous engagements. Where a Zero pilot could reasonably expect to chase down most American aircraft he had encountered up to that point, given enough altitude and position, this twin-engine fighter, once it committed to a dive, accelerated and pulled away at a rate his own aircraft simply could not match. He recalled attempting to follow one of the American fighters down and being forced to break off, unable to close the distance, watching it disappear low over the water and jungle canopy long before he could bring his guns to bear. This was not an isolated impression. Japanese pilots across the Pacific, in official reports and post-war recollections alike, developed a grudging respect for the P-38's diving performance. Specifically, a quality rooted directly in the same twin-engine design that gave it such exceptional range. A Zero, built to be light enough to outturn anything in a slow, tight circle, could not be pushed into a high-speed dive without risking exactly the kind of control problems the captured Akutan Zero tests had revealed to American engineers the year before. A P-38, by contrast, was heavy, robust, and powerful enough to dive away from a fight at speeds a pursuing Zero simply could not follow, without risking structural damage of its own. Japanese aviators reportedly gave the aircraft the nickname the Fork-tailed Devil, in recognition of both its unusual twin-boom silhouette and its ability to disengage from a fight almost at will, appearing suddenly, striking hard, and vanishing before Japanese fighters could organize an effective pursuit. Beyond the immediate escort pilots, the P-38's reputation among Japanese aviators had actually been building for months before Operation Vengeance, largely through the air battles over New Guinea, where 5th Air Force squadrons flying the Lightning had begun inflicting steady losses on Japanese aircraft operating far from their home bases. Japanese pilot training materials and unit reports from the period reportedly began including specific cautions about the aircraft's diving speed and its unusual resistance to the kind of tight, sustained turning fights that had worked so effectively against Wildcats and early American fighters. It was a rare case of Japanese aviation doctrine adapting specifically around the characteristics of a single opposing aircraft type, a testament to how much of an impression the Lightning had already made even before it became famous for the Yamamoto mission specifically. John Mitchell himself received relatively little public recognition for the navigation feat that made the entire mission possible, even though pilots and historians who studied the mission afterward consistently described his flight planning as the single hardest and most decisive element of the operation. Shooting down Yamamoto's bomber required only a few minutes of aerial combat once the American fighters arrived at the right place and time. Getting 18 aircraft to that exact place and time, over 600 miles of open ocean, with no navigational aids beyond a compass, a clock, and Mitchell's own calculations, without alerting a single Japanese coastal listening post along the way, was the harder and far less celebrated achievement, one that several aviation historians have since argued deserved recognition equal to the credit given the pilots who fired the fatal shots. In the chaos of those first few minutes over Bougainville, the surviving Zero pilots faced an impossible tactical problem of their own. Their primary duty was protecting the bombers, not engaging in a prolonged dogfight, and the sudden appearance of American fighters diving from an unexpected angle meant they had to choose, almost instantly, between breaking formation to chase the attacking P-38s or holding position to continue guarding aircraft that, within seconds, were already falling out of the sky trailing smoke. By the time the escort pilots fully grasped what was happening, both bombers were already going down, and the mission the Zero pilots had been sent to protect had already failed in a way no amount of skill or aggression on their part could have reversed. One surviving pilot's account described the strange helplessness of watching the entire engagement end almost before it had properly begun, a sensation he compared to arriving at a fire after the building had already burned to the ground. News of Yamamoto's death was withheld from the Japanese public for over a month, treated by Imperial General Headquarters as a matter of the gravest secrecy, both to manage the shock to civilian and military morale and to avoid revealing exactly how the ambush had been arranged in the first place. When the announcement was finally made in late May of 1943, it was framed for the Japanese public as a death in the course of active duty at the front, without any suggestion that his precise route had been intercepted and decoded weeks in advance. Yamamoto's ashes were returned to Japan aboard the battleship Musashi, one of the two largest battleships ever built by any navy, a symbol of exactly the kind of overwhelming naval power Yamamoto had spent his career building and, in his more private and pessimistic moments before the war, had doubted could ever truly overcome American industrial strength in a long fight. A state funeral was held in Tokyo, one of the largest in Japanese history to that point, and Yamamoto was posthumously promoted, an honor reflecting his standing as arguably the single most respected commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy. For the pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron who had flown the mission, official recognition was, ironically, muted for similar reasons of secrecy. Publicizing the details of Operation Vengeance too widely risked exposing exactly the kind of code-breaking success that had made it possible. And the full story of how thoroughly American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese naval communications would not become fully public for years after the war ended. There is a strange coda to the secrecy surrounding the mission that is worth including on its own. Because so few people were briefed on the true source of the intelligence behind Operation Vengeance, American commanders worried for months afterward that Japan might notice the suspicious precision of the ambush and correctly conclude its codes had been broken. To help mask the true source, American forces reportedly staged additional reconnaissance flights near Bougainville in the days after the attack, and allowed rumors to spread suggesting coast watchers or visual sighting reports, rather than code-breaking, had tipped off the interception, a deliberate deception layered on top of an already secret mission. Japan, in the end, never significantly altered its naval codes in response, a decision that allowed American cryptanalysts to keep reading Japanese naval communications for the remainder of the war, arguably one of the most consequential intelligence victories to come out of the entire Yamamoto operation, separate from the death of Yamamoto himself. The death of Isoroku Yamamoto did not change the ultimate trajectory of the Pacific War, which by April of 1943 had already begun to turn decisively against Japan following Midway and the grinding, months-long campaign for Guadalcanal. But it removed, at a single stroke, the one commander most Japanese naval officers regarded as capable of improvising a way out of Japan's worsening strategic position, a leader whose personal prestige had done as much to hold together Japanese naval strategy as any single operational plan he had ever devised. His replacement, Admiral Minachi Koga, was a competent officer but never commanded the same level of confidence, respect, or strategic imagination that Yamamoto had, and Japanese naval planning in the war's final 2 years never again produced anything resembling the audacious, high-stakes gambles that had defined Yamamoto's approach from Pearl Harbor through Midway. The P-38 Lightning, meanwhile, went on to become one of the defining American fighters of the entire Pacific theater, prized above nearly every other aircraft for exactly the quality that had made Operation Vengeance possible in the first place: range. In the skies over New Guinea and the Philippines, the aircraft's combination of range, firepower, and diving speed made it the fighter of choice for America's two highest-scoring aces of the entire war, Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire, both flying with 5th Air Force squadrons that leaned on the Lightning's unmatched reach to hunt Japanese aircraft across distances no single-engine American fighter of the period could safely cover. Japanese pilots who faced the P-38 in the years after Yamamoto's death continued to describe the same basic lesson learned that April morning, near Bougainville: catch it if you can, but do not try to follow it down. There is one final irony worth sitting with before closing this story: the lingering dispute between Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber over who actually delivered the fatal shots to Yamamoto's bomber, a disagreement that hardened over decades into a genuine and bitter rivalry between two men who had flown the same historic mission together, outlived both pilots, and was still being argued by historians, wreckage investigators, and aviation enthusiasts long after either man had died. It is a small, almost petty postscript to one of the most carefully planned and consequential fighter missions of the war, but it says something true about how history gets remembered. The mission itself, built on months of patient code-breaking and a navigation plan precise enough to find one small formation of aircraft across 600 miles of open ocean, came down in the end to a few seconds of gunfire that two men who were there could never fully agree on. Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire, the two American aces whose rivalry for the title of top-scoring pilot of the war played out almost entirely in P-38 cockpits over New Guinea and the Philippines. Each finished the war with a score higher than any other American pilot in any theater, a direct testament to how well the Lightning's long range and diving speed suited the vast distances and hit-and-run tactics of the Pacific Air War. Bong, reserved and famously reluctant to discuss his own growing legend, and McGuire, more openly competitive about the title, never flew together in a unit rivalry so pointed that it became something close to a running story across the entire Southwest Pacific Theater, each man's total climbing in counterpoint to the others through 1944. McGuire was killed in January of 1945 in a low-altitude dogfight attempting to help a squadron mate, a death that, fittingly, showcased both the aggressive flying style that built his score and the low-speed vulnerability that had always been the Lightning's one genuine weakness. Bong survived the war only to die months later testing an early American jet fighter back in the United States, a loss that closed out the story of America's two greatest aces within months of each other, on opposite sides of the transition from propeller aircraft to the jet age. If you want to understand how one intercepted radio message, one impossibly precise navigation plan, and one strange twin-boomed fighter, built for range rather than agility, combined to end the life of the man who planned Pearl Harbor, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.